Hey everybody, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the work of Bob Camblin.
Bob
Yeah, you
Camblin.
know him.
Oh, yeah.
He's an artist whose work I always stop and think about.
I'm intrigued already.
Yeah, so we've got kind of a mix of stuff to work with today. We've got some excerpts from a book of his quotes and artwork, a
Mm.
little bit about his exhibitions and his achievements over the
His
years.
biography.
Exactly. And even a YouTube video that goes into one of his paintings, which I thought was pretty interesting.
It sounds like we've got a nice multimedia approach to this one. I like
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a really interesting deep dive because Camblin is a really interesting guy. Um, and just as an example, there's this one quote that really caught my eye, and it says, "Fortunately, some things remain forever, or another 10 years, perhaps."
That's great. I love it.
Yeah, it's classic Camblin, right? Like just a
Mm.
little dash of dry humor, but then
Yeah.
also like a very deep observation about just the nature of time.
Yeah. I love that little bit of wryness that comes through in that quote, and that's the kind of thing that makes you stop and think, oh, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping we can get to in this deep dive.
Yeah.
What is his artistic philosophy all about? How do Zen principles, which seem to be a big part of his work, how do they actually kind of manifest on the canvas? And what is it about that blend of humor and insight that I think really makes his work so compelling?
I think those are all really great questions, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to exploring those with you.
Awesome. Well, to kind of kick things off, I thought we could dive into some of his quotes because I really feel like they give us a direct line into his thought process.
Mhm.
And there's this one that I think is really kind of a core principle for him. He says, "I will stick with common sense and try for the perfectly average view of the universe." He puts that in quotes. "I think that will let me enjoy miracles on both sides of science and magic and the nuances of the smear between the whiteness and the blackness, and hope that I can be around when the two meet in the near future and we have an intensely bright gray."
That's a mouthful.
I know, right? There's a lot to unpack there.
It's quite a statement, but yeah, there's a lot there. And I think what really comes through to me in that quote is that he's pushing back against the idea of having to choose sides, right?
Mm.
Of rigidly defining the world as either, science or magic, black or white, good or evil.
Hmm.
Instead, he's seeking that middle ground, the gray area where seemingly opposing forces can coexist and maybe even complement one another.
I love how you put that gray area. I mean, it makes me think of the
Hmm.
you know the concept of the middle way in Zen Buddhism.
Exactly.
The idea that truth often lies somewhere between those extremes.
And that the path to enlightenment is often found in that balance. Mm.
I hadn't even connected it to the middle way specifically, but that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
He's not rejecting science or magic.
Mhm.
He's embracing both. He's finding that space where they complement each other. It's like he's saying,
Mhm.
let's not limit ourselves by clinging to one rigid perspective.
Absolutely. And it's not just about intellectual ideas. It seems to be a way of life for him. And there's another quote that highlights this. He says, when you think, don't act. When you act, don't think.
Whoa, hold on. When you think, don't act. When you act, don't think. That seems kind of contradictory, right?
It does on the surface, isn't it?
Is he saying we should just zone out and go through life on autopilot?
I don't think so at all. I think what he's getting at is the importance of being fully present in each moment,
Okay.
right? When we overthink, we get paralyzed by doubt and indecision. And conversely, when we act impulsively, we may not be fully considering the consequences, right? So it's about finding that balance between thoughtful deliberation and decisive action.
That actually makes a lot of sense. It's like he's advocating for kind of a mindful approach to life,
Mm.
a state of being where we're aware of our thoughts and our actions without being totally consumed by them.
I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah, that mindful approach to life.
Okay, now for a quote that made me laugh out loud,
Okay.
he says, "My attempts to stop arguing created an argument." I mean, who hasn't been there?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Sometimes the more you try to avoid conflict,
Mm-hmm.
the more you seem to attract it.
The irony is not lost on me, for sure.
But there's also that self-awareness there, right? Like that willingness to kind of poke fun at himself and acknowledge the irony of the situation. But I also sense a deeper message about the nature of communication.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right on there. What do you think he's getting at with that?
Well, I mean, if our goal is to win an argument,
Hmm.
to kind of force our viewpoint on someone else, are we really communicating
Right.
or are we just engaging in this kind of battle of the egos?
Yeah, we're just trying to be right. And often when we're trying so hard to be right, we're not really listening.
Yeah, exactly. And genuine communication requires a willingness to listen. to understand another perspective, even if we don't agree with it.
Absolutely. And that's a principle that seems to be at the heart of Zen philosophy, right? A focus on open-mindedness, acceptance, and seeing things from multiple perspectives.
Totally. All right, this next quote really highlights Camblin's connection to the natural world. He says, "Not a leaf moves, and yet we all feel the cool breeze."
It's so simple, yet so profound.
I know, it's such a simple observation, yet it really speaks volumes about his attentiveness to his surroundings.
It does.
It reminds me of those moments when you're out in nature and you certainly become aware of the subtle shifts in the air, the sounds, the light. There's a stillness, a sense of peace that can be so profound.
It's like he's capturing those little moments of Zen that we experience in everyday life.
Exactly. It's like he's reminding us to pay attention to those details, to appreciate that quiet beauty that we often miss in our busy lives.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important message, especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with stimuli and information.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and speaking of paying attention, there's this quote that just feels like Camblin having a conversation with the universe itself.
Oh, I want to hear this one.
He says, "Well, that's enough about me, Mother Nature. Let's talk about you. What did you think of my last picture?"
Oh my God. I love that he's so sassy.
I know, right? It's hilarious.
That's brilliant.
Like he sees nature as this collaborator,
Yeah.
a source of inspiration and feedback.
Yeah, it's not this one-way street where he's just imposing his vision on the canvas. He's engaging with the natural world. He's having a dialogue with it.
It's beautiful and makes me wonder how these ideas, this reverence for nature, this playful spirit, how does that actually show up in his art?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I think that's where we need to shift our focus next. Let's dive into that YouTube video that analyzes his painting Untitled 108, because I think that's going to give us some real insight into how he visually translates these philosophical ideas onto the canvas.
All right, let's see what visual language Camblin is speaking.
Let's do it.
Okay, so this YouTube video is describing Untitled 108. It's kind of this layered piece with these like muted blues and greens.
Oh, interesting.
And it sounds like a landscape, but sort of abstract.
Huh.
Like looking through a window into another reality or something.
That's a really cool way to put it, like a window into another reality.
Yeah.
I like that. And that layered aspect, the, picture within a picture like they're talking about in the video, that really speaks to those Zen concepts of emptiness and form we touched on earlier, right?
Yeah, so I get the basic idea of emptiness, not being like nothingness, but more like potential or something like that.
Right.
But how does that actually translate visually in this painting? Like, is it the frame itself that's the emptiness and the image inside is the form?
That's one way to look at it for sure. The frame could represent that kind of threshold between our everyday perception and a deeper level of awareness.
Okay.
And then the image inside the frame, even though it's abstract, it still hints at these natural forms,
Yeah.
maybe hills, water, sky emerging from that emptiness.
Yeah, I'm starting to see it.
Yeah.
So it's like the painting itself is kind of a meditation, drawing us into that contemplative space where we can actually experience those Zen principles directly.
Exactly. And the video makes this other point about just the act of framing something, of creating a boundary,
Right.
is itself a form of contemplation.
Oh, interesting.
Right. It's about focusing our attention, choosing what to include and what to leave out.
Which makes me think about the I Ching connection the video mentioned. Didn't they say it relates to hexagram 20 Quan, which means contemplation?
Yeah.
Now, I have to admit, I'm not super familiar with the I Ching. Could you give me like a super quick rundown?
Sure. So the I Ching is this ancient Chinese text used for divination and wisdom. And each hexagram is made up of 6 lines, either broken or solid, representing yin and yang energies.
Oh, okay.
And so hexagram 20, with its emphasis on observation and clarity, that seems to fit really well with that frame structure in Untitled 108.
I see. So it's like Camblin is using this like visual language of the painting
Right.
to sort of echo the wisdom of the I Ching.
Yeah.
The frame becomes a symbol for that like elevated perspective.
That higher vantage point. Yeah.
Yeah, that ability to kind of step back and see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And even the interplay of light and dark tones in the painting, those muted blues and greens you were talking about, those could be seen as representing the balance of yin and yang.
Wow, so much symbolism packed into one painting.
Yeah, right.
It's like a puzzle, and every piece we uncover just reveals another layer of meaning.
Yeah, it really speaks to the depth and complexity of Camblin's artistic vision. It's not just about creating a pleasing image, it's about using visual language to convey these really profound ideas and to invite the viewer into a deeper level of engagement.
Speaking of engaging with art, There's another one of Camblin's quotes that comes to mind here. He says, art is not just images. Art for art's sake has become art for life's sake, or art for my sake, or art for survival's sake. What do you make of that?
It almost sounds like a manifesto, doesn't it?
It does. It
Yeah.
feels like he's kind of challenging that traditional idea of art as something separate from everyday life.
I think you're right on there. He's pushing back against this notion that art should exist solely for its own sake, detached from the realities of the world.
Yeah.
Instead, he's suggesting that art is inherently connected to life, to our experiences, to our struggles, to our search for meaning.
And it also makes me think about like the historical context of his work.
Mm-hmm.
He was creating art during a time of like major social and artistic upheaval.
Oh, for sure.
And this idea of questioning the purpose of art seems to align with, movements like conceptual art, where the idea behind the work was often more important than the object itself.
Absolutely. And remember, we saw that Camblin was exhibiting at the Whitney Museum in the 1970s, right?
Right.
Right in the thick of those debates about the nature and function of art.
Yeah.
So it's not hard to imagine him being influenced by those conversations and kind of pushing the boundaries in his own way.
Yeah, and speaking of pushing boundaries, there's this other quote that I find both amusing and kind of provocative.
What's that?
He says, "A critic is a legless man who teaches running." It's a pretty scathing critique, isn't it?
It is a bit harsh, yeah. Is he saying art critics are totally irrelevant?
Well, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but he's definitely challenging their authority.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, don't just blindly accept what someone else tells you about art. Experience it for yourself. Form your own opinions. Trust your own instincts.
I like that. Trust your own instincts.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with the Zen principles
Right.
and the emphasis on direct experience. It's about trusting your own intuition, not just relying on someone else's interpretation.
Exactly. And it also connects back to that quote about finding the balance between believing and knowing.
Oh, yeah.
He says, believing and knowing are different. Most people practice a belief or a religion. They were raised in mystics. Know something else. They remain connected to a faith or abandon it. But they have been somewhere, and logic won't make the trip. One must look for the balance of intuition and logic.
Right, but isn't that balance a bit precarious?
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't relying too much on intuition kind of risk leading us astray?
It's a valid concern, but I don't think he's advocating for blind faith or abandoning logic altogether.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that there are aspects of reality that can't be fully grasped through intellect alone.
Okay.
Intuition, feeling, direct experience. These are also valid ways of knowing.
So it's like he's expanding our very definition of what it means to know something. It's not just about rational understanding. It's about engaging with the world on multiple levels. Intellectually, emotionally, intuitively.
And that multi-layered approach seems to be reflected in his artistic style as well.
Now that you mention it, I'm curious to hear more about his artistic style. Like, what makes a Camblin painting distinctly? A Camblin, what are those visual elements or techniques that kind of stand out?
Well, based on what we've seen in the images of his work and that description of Untitled 108, it seems like he leans towards abstraction, but not in a way that completely abandons recognizable forms.
Right.
He uses these muted colors, organic lines, suggestive shapes that evoke a sense of nature without being literal depictions.
The video actually used the phrase a fluidity, where the forms seem both grounded in nature and yet dissolve into abstraction. I thought that was really well put.
It's a great way to put it.
It captures that kind of movement, between the tangible and the intangible that I feel when I look at his work.
And that's a key characteristic of his style, wouldn't you say? That fluidity, that ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's inviting the viewer to participate in the meaning-making process.
Right.
We're not given a definitive interpretation. We're encouraged to bring our own experiences and perspectives to the work.
Which makes me think of his quote, "We may be moving to a participatory type of art." It sounds like he really envisioned this shift from art as like a passive object to be observed to art as like an experience to be shared, between the artist and the viewer.
And remember, he was writing this long before interactive installations and performance art became mainstream.
Right.
So he seemed to have this intuitive sense of where art might be heading.
In that idea of participatory art, of the viewer being an active participant in the creative process, that really aligns with those Zen principles we keep coming back to.
It does, yeah.
It's about breaking down those barriers between the observer and the observed, recognizing that interconnectedness of all things.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
There's actually another quote from Camblin that I think kind of connects to this idea of art as a collaborative process.
Okay.
He says, "If you argue or if you agree, you may learn, but you do not communicate." How does that relate back to participatory art?
Well, I think he's drawing a distinction between merely expressing opinions and engaging in genuine dialogue.
Okay.
True communication, in his view, requires a willingness to listen deeply, to consider other perspectives, to be open to changing our own minds. And
Right.
that's where the collaboration comes in. When we approach art or any creative endeavor with that open and receptive mindset, we create a space for something new and unexpected to emerge.
And that seems to be another hallmark of Camblin's work, the element of surprise. We see
Yeah.
it in his quotes with their blend of humor and profound insight, and we see it in his art with its suggestive forms and layered meanings.
Absolutely.
He's not trying to spoon-feed us a specific message. He's inviting us to explore, to question, to discover for ourselves.
He's a master of the open question, isn't he?
Yeah, and that ties back to, like, we know one of his other quotes. He says, "My pictures are questions, not answers."
I love that.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we move on, I do want to circle back to Camblin's exhibition history for a moment. We know he had a long and successful career,
Yeah.
exhibiting everywhere from, like, regional galleries to prestigious institutions like the Whitney Museum.
Right. What do you mean? That's a big deal.
What does that tell us about kind of his journey as an artist and the reception of his work?
I think it speaks to his artistic vision and his ability to connect with a really wide audience.
Okay.
The fact that he was included in these major exhibitions alongside, other prominent artists of his time suggests that his work was being recognized as significant and influential within the art world.
Yeah, and that retrospective exhibition in Houston, those are usually reserved for artists who have achieved a certain level of, recognition and respect.
Oh, definitely.
It's like a culmination of his life's work, a chance for people to see the full scope of his artistic journey.
And it speaks to the lasting impact of his work. The fact that a retrospective was held so many years after his peak suggests that his art continues to resonate with people, that it still has something to offer us today.
Absolutely. There's one more concept I want to make sure we cover before we wrap up this deep dive. Camblin's idea of the hologram.
Ah, yes, the hologram, such a powerful metaphor.
I know there's that quote where he says, "Hologram, the whole message, we are no longer shadows on the cave wall. We are holograms, and the more we get together, the clearer it becomes."
Oh, wow.
What a beautiful and profound way to kind of describe our interconnectedness.
It's incredible, yeah. I love that image of us moving beyond the shadows, becoming more than just two-dimensional representations.
Yeah, can you break down this whole hologram concept a bit more for me? Like, what's the deeper meaning he's getting at here?
I think it's about recognizing the inherent wholeness and interconnectedness of reality,
Okay.
He's suggesting that each individual, like a fragment of a hologram, contains within them a piece of the larger picture.
Uh,
And it's through our interactions, our connections, our shared experiences that the full image comes into focus.
It reminds me of that Zen saying, a single raindrop doesn't make a sound.
Right.
It's in coming together and recognizing our interdependence that we create something greater than the sum of our parts.
Exactly. And this idea of the hologram is not just some abstract philosophical concept. It has real-world implications for how we live our lives, how we relate to each other, how we create art, how we build communities.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. The Zen principles, the emphasis on balance and interconnectedness, the concept of the hologram, they all point towards this way of seeing the world that is both expansive and deeply human.
And that's the beauty of Camblin's work, isn't it? He's not just presenting us with ideas. He's inviting us to embody them, to live them, to experience them for ourselves.
As we've been kind of going deeper into Camblin's world,
Mm-hmm.
I'm so struck by how multifaceted he is.
He is.
He's an artist, a
Yeah.
thinker, a philosopher, a Zen practitioner, a comedian,
It's all there.
all rolled into one.
And that's what makes him so fascinating. He defies easy categorization.
Right.
He challenges us to embrace complexity and nuance. He reminds us that life is not about finding one right answer, but about embracing the mystery and the paradox of existence.
And he does it all with such a unique blend of humor and insight and artistic skill.
Yeah.
It's like he's cracked the code of how to make these profound ideas accessible and engaging.
I couldn't agree more. Camblin's work is a gift, a treasure trove of wisdom and inspiration that continues to resonate long after we've encountered it.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of his world,
Yeah.
but I think it's time to start bringing this deep dive to a close.
Okay.
Where do we go from here? How do we kind of sum up the essence of Bob Camblin and what his work means for us today? It feels like we've been on this incredible journey through, Camblin's mind, or exploring his art, his philosophy, and his really unique way of seeing the world.
It really does. And it's a journey I think that we could continue for quite a while because there's so much depth and nuance to his work that every encounter offers something new.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm.
I'm curious, how would you sum up the essence of Bob Camblin? What's his lasting impact, you think, on the world of art and ideas?
That's a great question. I think Bob Camblin was above all a bridge builder.
A bridge builder.
Yeah, he bridged the gap between Eastern and Western thought, between art and life, between the intellectual and the intuitive.
I like that.
Yeah, he showed us that seemingly opposing forces can coexist and even complement each other, and that embracing paradox can actually lead to a richer, more nuanced understanding of reality.
You know, that really resonates with me. He wasn't afraid to kind of blur the lines. To challenge conventions, to encourage us to question our own assumptions and to look beyond those surface appearances.
Absolutely. And he did it all with such a playful spirit, a sense of humor that makes his work both profound and approachable.
Hmm.
He never took himself too seriously, even when tackling those really big questions about the meaning of life and the nature of art.
That's what makes his work so compelling, right? It's both intellectually stimulating and emotionally resonant. It kind of speaks to our heads and our hearts.
It does, and it's so relevant, I think, for today, in a world that often feels so divided and chaotic. Camblin's message of balance, interconnectedness, and mindfulness feels more important than ever.
Absolutely. His art reminds us to slow down, to pay attention, to appreciate that beauty and mystery that surround us, and to kind of find the humor in the everyday.
Right, to not take ourselves too seriously.
Very
And
well
remember
said.
that we're all part of something larger than ourselves, and that our individual perspectives, like fragments of a hologram, contribute to a greater whole.
What a powerful image. It makes me think about how we can all be those bridge builders in our own way.
Mhm.
Connecting with others, sharing our unique perspectives, and creating something beautiful and meaningful together.
And that's ultimately what Camblin's art, I think, calls us to awaken to that interconnectedness of all things, to embrace the fullness of life with all its paradoxes and uncertainties, and to find that joy and wonder in every moment.
So as we conclude our deep dive into the world of Bob Camblin, we leave you with this final thought-provoking question. How can you bring a little bit of Camblin's spirit into your own life? Where can you be a bridge builder? How can you find that balance between thinking and acting, between science and magic, between humor and seriousness?
And most importantly, how can you embrace that perfectly average view of the universe, finding the miracles on both sides of the spectrum and creating your own intensely bright gray?
I love that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Bob Camblin.
My pleasure.